Hello, and welcome to the How I Tested That podcast. I'm your host, David J. Bland. I'm an author and advisor, and I'm fascinated with testing early-stage ideas. I've helped companies all around the world, and in this podcast, I connect with entrepreneurs and innovators who had the courage to test their ideas with real people in the market, with sometimes surprising results. Please join us as we explore the ups and downs of experimentation together. In this episode, I'm joined by Barry O'Reilly. He's an entrepreneur, advisor, author, and a friend of mine who works with executives to redesign how their organizations perform. He's also the co-founder of Nobody Studios, an AI venture studio building and launching over 100 companies. Barry and I chat about what he's learned from years of helping corporations experiment, redesign systems, and make better decisions under extreme uncertainty. We talk about why so many AI transformations start in the wrong place, why leaders should focus on the work before the tools, and how capturing conversations can create a kind of organizational memory that gets smarter over time. Barry also shares his lessons from building Nobody Studios and how that work influenced his new book, Artificial Organizations. If you want to learn more about testing with AI to redesign how work gets done while making better decisions, you'll love this episode. Enjoy my conversation with Barry O'Reilly. Welcome to the podcast, Barry.
Always good to spend time together, David. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Dude, I'm so happy that you were able to come on here because I have known you for quite some time and I consider you a friend and just professionally somebody that I learned a lot from. And I was thinking back to when we first met, and I think it was 2014 in London when we were at Neo doing an event, and then there was some after hours. And I had already been following your work, and people were like, oh yeah, you got to meet this guy, Barry. And it was so cool to meet you in person and hang out with you. And I had learned so much even before just reading your stuff and then being able to hang out and get to know you. And then since then, just watching you grow and just push yourself and learn different things and try different things. It's going to be really hard for us to cover everything in our conversation today that I want to talk about. But I'm just really excited to just hang out and just geek out over stuff with you.
Yeah, and I can only say, David, I feel the same. You know, like I've always been a fan. Your Twitter accounts, what can I say? They're amazing. I had the good old days of Twitter. But yeah, no, like I think this is one of the fun things about the world we're working in is that you meet so many people actually probably virtually before you ever meet them in person. And I sort of, I guess, have always measured people in terms of the quality of what they share and the insights they're willing to put out there, whether they're perfect or not, you know, and that's really what probably drew me to the work you were doing. So yeah, it was amazing to meet in person in a pub in London over 10 years ago. And it's great, again, to continue, as you say, friendship and camaraderie, building this stuff out together. So it's great to be on the podcast. Thanks.
Yeah, there's so many topics around just uncertainty and testing I want to cover, but maybe catching up our listeners on what you're all about. I think when we first met, oh my gosh, I don't know if Lean Enterprise was out, maybe. I'm trying to think, what year was that published again?
Yeah, that's actually, it's funny you say that. I'd say maybe we must have met in the summer, and the book, I think, came out towards the end of that year. So maybe we were in sort of our penultimate drafts. And yeah, like again, like most people, like working in the Lean startup world, that book, Lean Enterprise, was co-authored with Jez Humble and Joanne Molesky. Many people will probably know Jez as the co-author of Continuous Delivery and I guess heavily involved in DORA, which is this metrics for measuring performance in software engineering world. So that book paired up with the Lean startup movement really just sort of exploded. And I was working at a company called ThoughtWorks at the time, which was sort of one of those pioneers in agile software development. Martin Fowler still works there. There's Jim Highsmith was there. Just like loads of people, which was a great growth personal experience for me in my career to just be around folks like that. And, you know, just being a sponge, really learning from all the things they had done. But yeah, like a year later, I moved to San Francisco, which was even better because we were pretty much neighbors at that point. And, you know, started my own advisory business and working with different companies in the space, which was great. I wrote another book called Unlearn, which was inspired really from the insight of working with all these companies, where the thing I kept finding was learning new skills was not difficult for these very smart executives. The hardest part was letting go of their existing behavior, the things that had made them successful to that point, to sort of innovate, if you will, their behavior and thinking. And again, that book was sort of a nice build onto what Lean Enterprise was about, which was experimentation in large scale companies. Yeah. And then after that, I ended up starting an early stage incubator called Nobody Studios in 2021, where our mission was to try and build 100 companies over the next 5 years. And yeah, there's lots of fun, especially in the world of testing business ideas that I can share, both personal experiences and growing that business. So maybe that'll be a fun point for us to noodle on the show.
It will be. I have to say, though, I don't know if I've ever shared this with you or even publicly, but I think what drew me to your work was you're one of the few people applying this stuff to big companies early on. And you were willing to take on that challenge. At Lean Startup Movement had started and everyone's like, oh yeah, it's great. And then there was a small set of us and we're like, big companies really need this. Maybe more so than startups. And I remember shopping a book idea around. And I was going to all these publishers like, hey, I got this great idea. I'm going to write this book and it's going to be like Lean Startup in the Enterprise or Lean Enterprise. And all the publishers like, no, that's already been being written. And I was like, crap, who's right? And then I realized it was you and some other people. And I was like, okay, you're going to do a good job. But like, that was initially my first book pitch was like, oh, how do you do this in enterprise? I should write a book about that. Now, granted, I finally ended up writing a best-selling book later, but I always feel like you're always pushing things and you're kind of on this edge. I would say it's like a growing edge. You're kind of in this one where you're like, yeah, I think I'll be okay here and I'll figure it out. And then you just do. And it's really, I really appreciate that in you.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. It means a lot. But you're right. Like some of these things, your life sometimes doesn't make sense until you look at it in retrospect, but at the time you just sort of follow, I guess, the signal to a certain extent, right? Like for me, even that move from writing Lean Enterprise, which was, as you say, experimentation in large scale companies, to suddenly then writing a book about mindset and behavior, like that didn't make sense to me. I never would have said that at the end of finishing, but the work led me there, which was the interesting thing as you say that, is the insights were from, if you will, testing the content with these super smart people. Like we were coaching executive team from Capital One, from Slack, from Skyscanner, Spotify, all the Wells Fargo, all these amazing companies and really, really talented, bright people. And they all wanted to learn how to move faster, make better decisions, build better products. The curiosity was always there. But again, from working in those environments, I guess the thing I learned from it was that it was never about could people do an experiment. It was actually could they shift their mindset and also shift their behavior to create the systems in place to allow that experimentation flourish, if you will. And that's actually, again, what inspired me to write about that, because it was just what I was experiencing, and all my writing has always been like a sort of retrospective, if you will, of what I've learned from the last experience. And again, like I think people, and I know you've been through this too as well, right? Like you're helping all these amazing companies from Toyota to, all these brilliant companies test their ideas, right? And I guess maybe to you, like what are some of those insights you've had, about what helps companies succeed or maybe what helps leaders succeed?
Yeah, it's, I've learned a lot and I've worked with so many different types of companies. We just had Mark Graban on and we were talking about psychological safety and what prevents people from running experiments. We had this long conversation about people don't feel it's like they're safe. It's not safe to say, I don't know, or, that experiment failed. And it's very interesting because when you talk to leaders, it's not necessarily the culture they're trying to create, not intentionally anyway, but it still happens. And so it's this really interesting mindset plus culture plus systems kind of mix that I'm seeing inside companies. And the companies that end up doing it really well, I feel as if leaders are very intentional about, okay, how do I address this beyond just me saying, go do something? The leaders say, oh, go run experiments. And then they'll get really frustrated, like, why aren't you running experiments? And it's like, well, the systems and the culture doesn't actually support me. Like you say that, but then I have to submit all these approvals to ever talk to a customer, or I'm not allowed, like sales doesn't want to talk to a customer and do this kind of work because they don't want to confuse them and they want to close deals. And there's all this interesting, almost like the incentives for each type of function work against each other. And therefore, even though we give lip service to it, it can be really challenging to pull it off unless you have support from the top down.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You said my favorite word there, which is systems as well. For me, I think that is actually where most of my curiosity now probably lies, is building the internal systems to allow this type of work to flourish. Because they're design choices. I'll give you a really sort of nice example of this. So many years ago, I worked with Skyscanner when they were 30 people in Edinburgh, right? This is probably about 18 months before I met you. I was up in Edinburgh when they were probably 30 people. And one of the graduates, a guy called Andrew Phillips, had just joined as an engineer. Years later, he's now the CTO of the company, which is awesome. But, one of the things that he was great at role modeling, and this is something I think is really, really important, even lately as all these new amazing tools have come into the market. And you can imagine like Skyscanner are dealing with like billions of transactions a day. They're a data-focused company, really. So using all these tools, and he's the CTO, like people sometimes might be looking for him to have all these answers, which is impossible because he can't be a data scientist and understand React frameworks for the web and sit in business meetings and right, like it's just impossible. So one of the great things I think Andrew did in that company was he was very open about saying, look, I don't know what these tools are good at, what they're not good at, but I'm going to start using them on a day-to-day basis in the company, and I'm going to share what I'm finding them useful for or not. And I'm going to start creating this sort of environment, as you say, where I'm role modeling, right? He didn't set like an AI mandate that everyone has to use these tools. He's like, right, we probably need to embrace this. Here's how I'm going to try and tackle it. I'm going to role model what works, what doesn't, what I'd use again, what I wouldn't. And I'm going to share that back with the team. And, like that kind of, again, it's a human factors approach, but then he's also creating this system underneath, which is actually quite intentional, as you're describing, where they're creating a learning community where people then start suddenly, well, if the CTO is saying, oh, I just tried to use whatever Claude code and I think it sucks, and because here's the use case I was using it for, other people are like, oh, wow, okay. That's interesting because I tried Perplexity to solve that problem and I feel I got a better result with it. Here's why I think that, right? So you suddenly have this experimentation being, again, the conditions being put in place to allow it to flourish and for information to be shared and ultimately leveraged. And I think that's kind of, for me, it's both an intentional human choice, but there's also operational model and mechanic put in place to allow that information to move around, and that's sort of what's kind of fascinating to me is when you have leaders starting to behave like that. They're the ones that I think are reaping a lot of the rewards.
Maybe this is time that systems and systems thinking finally has its moment to shine, because I've seen some of the big AI companies are like, hey, we need systems people in here now because we are trying to do this AI transformation work, and we're pushing things in different ways that maybe finally break this model that we've been clinging to since the industrial era of how we set up and manage our work and organize our companies. And systems, I mean, you're going to have to know how things relate and connect and what reinforces and what balances. And I mean, not to geek out of it too much, but I've been saying for like a decade that systems thinking is like going to come back this year, and it's never happened. But maybe this is finally the time where people start to value it, because really they're starting to look at their organization as a system.
Yeah, it's fascinating as well, because again, I think the people who were reaping the most reward from the moment that we're like in and maybe moving to are very also intentional. Like they think of architecture. They think about how they architect their company. So I'll give you another example. Like when we started our venture studio, Nobody Studios, the idea was that we had to, if you will, create a platform where entrepreneurs would want to build on our platform, which means to get an acceleration from building their company. So our platform, if you can imagine, had to have different sort of APIs or services, right? It needs a sales support function. It needs a marketing function. It needs operations, hiring, financial management, right? Like these are all systems, talent acquisition, right? These are all, if you will, the promise of why an entrepreneur would want to plug into your systems to get an acceleration, that you have the sort of beginnings of the infrastructure they need so they can just focus on solving the business problem. And then they can get a bump because, I need to hire 4 engineers. Great. We've already got a talent pool. Here they are. Just plug into that API and off you go. So one of the things I probably found most fun, which I didn't actually think when we started the studio, was designing all of these, if you will, internal systems to support the entrepreneurs. So the product went from the startup we were building to actually the internal systems that we were providing to our customer, aka the entrepreneurs that come into the studio. So for me, I was suddenly in this new little happy space of hey, if I was an entrepreneur, what would be the best talent acquisition experience that if I just rocked in and I was right, I need, 2 engineers, a designer and a UX person, and I need to run a customer interview next week. What would that experience look like? And that, again, to your point of testing ideas, that was fun. And we tried everything. We were doing experiments deeply investing in 4 or 5 people who were really good, say UX designers, that were really comfortable jumping from project to project. We were trying to find these archetypes of people. Because again, a lot of the work demand from the entrepreneurs, it might only be 6 or 8 hours worth of work. Can you redesign this landing page for me? Because, maybe they're a medical doctor. They've got a great idea, but they've never built a software product and they don't know how to build a landing page, right? So you want to be explaining to someone what the idea is, someone mocking it up, making a prototype and launching it for them, say it's a day's work, whatever. So we experimented with all sorts of things, like having a pool of trusted resources that were happy to do jumping in different projects. Again, one of our constraints was we were always trying to be time and capital efficient. So we didn't want to hire a bench of 10 UX people just sitting there waiting for demand. So it was a really fun sort of experimentation, if you will, about finding what's useful for the entrepreneur, and then also what's interesting for the person in the UX design. So these things turned into marketplaces, which were really fascinating concept too as well. Because again, with a marketplace, it needs to work for both sides of the equation. And you also have a quality aspect to it of you need what style of person works well with a certain style of entrepreneur, So yeah, it just became this algorithm. And that's just the talent acquisition example. There's a suite of these from sales, marketing, operations, finance across the whole company. And that actually has been probably one of the most fun and rewarding parts of the whole job, is actually testing business ideas in that space, if it makes sense.
It does. It's interesting that you were pulled into that sort of role. I'm wondering, is that sort of the foundation, everything you learned there, did that help inform Artificial Organizations, your new book? Was it that plus other things? What was feeding in to that book idea?
Yeah. Like you said, it's the same stuff, it's Derek Zoolander. It's the same look. Again, what I was learning about how I could make, and this is what, again, the insight for me is that everything ultimately comes down to making decisions about what designer to pair with that entrepreneur, what financial system to use to support that business to grow faster, what operating model. So one of the things, when we started the studio in 2021, the technology had not become front and center at that point, right? We were still highly reliant on human systems, I would describe us that. We had technology tools in place, we maybe had a Slack for, managing all the communication for all the different teams. We would have portfolio reviews, but we would still sort of manually get the startups to be creating their decks of what did they learn in the last month and what were their objectives and what challenges they faced and how their metrics looked. But it was this very sort of manual experience, right? Some of the startups would be so panicked about doing their monthly portfolio review that they would be spending 2, maybe even 3 days preparing 3 or 4 slides, which when we found that out, I was literally going, what are you doing? The point of this is not to be perfect presentation. It's meant to be a learning mechanism. right? But again, people just have anxiety when you've 14 other startups on this call and everybody's trying to be, the golden child. Are they going to get into trouble? To your point about fear and anxiety and safety earlier. So we were getting a lot of these perverse behaviors, which was, again, the exact opposite of what we wanted from an experience like that. So roll forward now, right? 22, 23, we suddenly have access then to the beginnings of these LLMs starting to come into place, where, again, a lot of the teams were quite engineering forward people. So suddenly we were able to shift quite from this manual recreation of context, if you want to call it, that's how I think about it, to this idea that we could gather all the information that was shared, like we could plug into an integration into Slack and pull down all the messages, the discussions. We were absolutely rigorous of transcribing and recording every single meeting we ever had and turning those into data assets. So like every startup, every conversation, download the transcript of the call, put it in a data pool and mine it. Like we were rigorous about that from day one. So everything is a data asset. And then mining the conversations from collaboration tools and then a synthesis. So capture, synthesize, and then producing the outputs. And like that was one of the biggest aha moments for so many people, both in the studio and the people we worked with, because all these sort of recreation of context, which shows up as the 3 days writing 3 slides for a presentation type stuff, we were able to shrink that. So these founders then were getting believe me, in the beginning, it was not very elegant, the output, but it moved their behavior. This is the thing that was so interesting to me, is the behavior started to shift, where instead of feeling they had to recreate the context and remember, they were actually in a more editing mode. So they sort of had like an MVP of what their report was, whether their weekly report, their monthly report, their daily report. And all they had to do were tweak things. So the energy moved from all this preparation of work to do a tiny decision to here's all the prep, double check it. Okay, now I'm back to actually solving the hard problem. Those were some of the, I guess, insights that really just started to appear, is that the magic is actually human plus machine equals better judgment. That was the sort of insight for me. And the machine's job was essentially to capture information, synthesize it, and then provide an output as requested by the human operator. And then the human's job was to judge and decide what information mattered and then make decisions and keep moving. That was really the core of what has now become, as you say, artificial organizations. It's all these systems and processes that we learned in the studio. As you say, they're helpful. I've redesigned fundamentally how I work. And my mindset about how work happens now is it's totally different. And that's super fun, right? And you're smiling because I know you're doing this stuff too as well, right? Like what a fun time to be playing around in redesigning really how we work.
Yeah, I mentioned this a little bit earlier. I have to come back to this, which is I've been so frustrated for so long. I think back when I was on Twitter, I had this meme that I would do every year. It was something like, oh, this is the year where we're not going to use management practices from the 50s or the 30s. Yeah. And we're not going to organize our companies like we did in the industrial era and run everything as projects and functional silos and measure hours. And I couldn't have predicted AI being the thing that finally breaks that model. And I'm kind of torn by that. But at the same time, something had to break that model. It made no sense for us to organize around knowledge work the same way we organized in factories. And I love the manufacturing industry. I fully appreciate what they do. And I have a bunch of manufacturing clients and I appreciate the culture they try to make and everything. But I felt like we're taking a model that we learned a long time ago and just kind of dragging it forward no matter what. And I don't think we're even beginning to know how disruptive AI is going to be to organizations and how we work. I think you're experiencing it probably a little more than others just because you live that in your studio and how you're building systems and everything. And you're more of an early adopter. But it's very interesting to me that we're all landing on decision making, or at least in our peer group. I think it was you, myself, Martin Erickson, Jason Frazier, maybe. We were at a table and we were all talking about what we're looking forward to. And it was all about decisions. We were talking about decisions. And Martin has his new book on decisions. We're actually going to have Martin on here in a few episodes too. And you're talking about how to make decisions and decision velocity. I remember you quoting that term. And I had kind of independently arrived on decision velocity on my side just because of what I'm seeing. And why do you think it is? Why is it that so many people are really starting to reevaluate decision making now that we're having this kind of disruptive change inside companies?
Yeah, so the log line of artificial organizations is kind of funny. AI isn't replacing leaders, it's exposing them. And the reason that is the line is it's sort of a summation of what you just were sharing. I think for many years, we've almost like sleepwalked into how we run and operate companies. It's been, as you say, just that's always the way things are done around here. We're replicating a model which was based on another industrial revolution time. And, that's just what people know, right? Like they go into these companies, managers and leaders are replicating, for the most part, what they've seen elsewhere. And it's a similar type of thing. But probably where that is at its finest point is decision making. So often, if you ask people, how do you make decisions? It sort of falls into this, like there's the one end of the spectrum, there's like the gut instinct character. They've been in the industry for 20 years. They've seen all the patterns. They know the signals intuitively, and they're running on instinct. So tenure, knowledge, experience carry weight in that world. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have the people who are naive to the domain or newbies, and they could never get access to the information, maybe at the same level. You could only gather information through experience, right? But now these technologies have sort of changed this whole model. Like information is everywhere. And actually what's stronger is if you have like really robust systems for making decisions and you can find the information you want and run it through those decision-making systems, suddenly it doesn't matter if you've had 20 years in the automotive industry. You have really good rigor about how you look for information, assumptions, test them, look at different scenarios, look for variables, play with the variables, and you're getting a probabilistic answer about what is potentially the best path forward, given all the inputs you've provided. And that doesn't matter if you are a 1-year grad out of wherever versus the 20-year veteran who's been in the business. And that is a real interesting sort of dynamic now. So again, for me, this is why judgment, again, becomes such a uniquely human thing, where we should never give up judgment, is my view. That is a human responsibility. It's a leadership responsibility. It's the choice that we need to own, always, in my opinion. But what the machines are amazing at is gathering information, synthesizing it, modeling it, running scenarios at volumes and speeds that humans can just know, one human can do. So for me, like that's why, again, I talk a lot in the book, it's human plus machine intelligence. So if you are that gut instinct character, if you're like the maverick type character, if you're just relying on that alone, you're in a world now where it's people who are learning very good decision-making rigor systems, and they're getting access to information, and then they're using that to model and make a choice. So if you just rely on gut, sure, like you're going to win sometimes, but in the long game, the probabilities are not in your favor. So I think this is, for me, the argument about why people have to embrace this way of working is because that's the path, right? It's an exponential curve over time, where if you have gut and you compare it, if you've got great human instinct and you compare it with machine insight, work together, that's a recipe for magic to happen. So that's what gets me kind of excited about all of this, and probably really a lot of the insights, because again, in our studio, because we treat every conversation as a data asset, it becomes a mine that like I can go back and say, right, when we were building, I don't know, one of our company, Ovations was a company we tried to build, which was an on-demand speaker platform. We had so many conversations about sourcing speakers, landing speakers, getting them into companies. Like And we've all that information, all that insight is in a database that we can go back and mine at any point and go, how did we make that decision? What were the circumstances? What were the variables? What were the unique moments that we made that choice that we thought it was the right one? And I can look at that forever. And I can use that to educate us on the next time we have to make a similar decision in the future, right? We have a decision log now. So again, the system is getting smarter by people participating in it. And for me, like, again, that just keeps raising the bar, right? Like that is a new, what moats are left now? Well, I think that your internal, if you will, like organizational intelligence or knowledge is probably going to be one of the biggest moats for most companies now, is their ability to capture, synthesize, and reuse their own information and how they use it to inform decisions.
Yeah, there's so much there in what you said. I feel as if one of the things that I was doing a keynote at Emory University in Atlanta, and this other presenter who I have a lot of respect for, his name is Dan Adams. He does a lot of voice of the customer work, and he's kind of old school guy, but he's really, really bright. And the way he described it to me was almost like, he called it like a digital waterline. And the idea here is the AI is really great at working with things that have been digitized. There's some digital form of that thing, whether it's a way of working or knowledge or whatever that is. But the things below that waterline that it can't see or it's unknowable, it doesn't know of yet, that's where you are using people, and people, I'm not using people, but people are shining, right? This is stuff that people can do. But my question to him was like, is that waterline dropping? Like, the more we digitize, maybe the less stuff that is defensible. And what I've seen, at least from the companies I coach, is this need for almost like a persistent memory inside the company of what they tried and what went wrong and what went sideways and what worked well, and being able to reference that and continue to learn from it, instead of having the same teams working on kind of the same idea, but they don't talk to each other, and one of them might succeed, one of them might fail, but they never really know why. That, while can work, it's not necessarily repeatable. And this idea of even like writing down your failures, why things failed, don't hide it. Like, let's document it so that next time maybe we make it a different kind of failure. We make better mistakes. That's one of my favorite sayings, like, make better mistakes. So it's just very interesting to me that I've had multiple conversations over the past few weeks with executives, and they've been talking a lot about this kind of institutional memory, or having something they can refer to. And I think it's partly because their data layers may be kind of a mess. They're not very, everything's fractured. And when they throw AI at fractured stuff, it just makes it worse. And I just keep hearing this from leaders on, we need to start having an opinion about how we gather and store this and be able to search it. And I think what a bunch of companies adopting AI are going to realize is that before they can really get a lot out of it, they have to do a lot of data work. And I don't know if they're fully up for that yet.
Yeah, no, and that's fair. So what I try to help people with, to what you're saying, right, is there's a couple of things they have to get. One, they have to actually have the mental breakthrough of what is possible with this technology, right? At the moment, sadly, most people are floating around with Microsoft Copilot, which is a mess, right? Because of all the points you said, their data is a mess, nothing's labeled. The tool itself is pretty weak in terms of an implementation of an LLM, right? So the experience is just 3 out of 10 at best. So they don't see the massive insight or change, right? Like, I was speaking to a CEO this week, and he was like, I've done it. I've done the Copilot thing. It's a mess. I have this vision of how I want my leadership operating system to be, and sadly, nothing Copilot offers does that. And he was talking about, he downloaded a transcription tool. I'll not name it, but it's a very popular one. And he used it for a week on his personal hobbies, right? He does a bit of sort of startup investing on the side, and whatever he does, right? And he literally was blown away by what the quality of capture, the insights that were shared back with him, the follow-up that it allowed him to do on these. And he was suddenly in this mode where he was like, oh my gosh, if I could operate like I'm doing in this little small AI stack I've created for myself in my corporate job, I could be like 50, 60% more effective. So that insight of an experiment in a sandbox environment, if you will, gave him this whole other impetus to say, okay, this actually is going to redesign how I work, right? They had the magic aha moment, because you see the benefit of what's possible, right? So for me, I'm often trying to say, changing the entire company is just impossible. It's just impossible to start at that level. So for leaders or teams or people, I would just encourage you to start with yourself and start experimenting. First of all, if you're in a big corporate, just try the tools that are available to you. Most companies are buying breadth, right? They're buying a Microsoft platform, a Google platform, right? So you have this those tools can never be as good as a niche tool that focuses on just transcription or just video capture or whatever it is, right? They can never be as good as the individual tools. But there's pros and cons of each model, right? The good thing about a consistent stack is that you can search the whole thing, you can plug things in. If you have a federated stack, you've got to make sure this Notion talks to your Gmail, talks to your whatever, I use Otter, all these tools, right? It's actually an orchestration job as well to make all those things talk to each other, and you can spend days messing around trying to make it work. So I think you have to understand these things. But the first principle is this idea of capture, transcribe, synthesize, and act. You've got to start thinking about capturing everything as a data asset, to your point. So you can synthesize it, you can transcribe that information into a database, and then start synthesizing it. And that's playing around with it in learning models, because ultimately the action, the machine is great at the capture and the transcription and the synthesize, but the action has to be human. It has to be that human judgment. What are you going to do with this decision log, this organizational intelligence you now have, this personal awareness of, I wish I wrote down every decision I ever made and went back and looked at it. Well, guess what? You can now. You really can. So it's I think the onus is on people now to go, right, these things are here. So the bus is heading in that direction. Just a couple of seats there. You can still grab a ticket.
I know I'm dating myself with this, and I may have mentioned on other episodes, but it kind of reminds me of the .com era a bit. We were like, everything online. Let's do everything online. And I was in my startup phase then. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of that, what is going on. And I think for us, we kind of view things as, well, let's break it down and test a small piece and see how the organization responds. I remember, I probably shouldn't have said this, but I was in my first large transformation in San Francisco, and I walked into the C-suite, which we had C-suite, and we had a bunch of VP, and we had a cross-functional leadership that kind of owned the change, which I thought I needed, because I'm like, without you owning the change and modeling the behavior and creating the culture, the change is not going to happen. And they were all really worried because we were trying all this stuff, And I remember the CEO looking at me, and he's like, man, I'm not sure how this is going to go. And I was like, oh, it's just one big experiment. And I was like, oh man, I should have thought before I said that. And he looked at me and he kind of laughed and he said, yeah, it kind of is. This is a big test. We don't know how the org is going to respond when we change different parts of things. And it was one of those few times where I was like, okay, actually, maybe I should have said that, but it wasn't intentional. It was just the way I approached the work. I can't approach a giant transformation and say, here's your 5-year plan and we're going to follow this and it's going to be okay. It's more of here are the capabilities you need to support your goal, and let's kind of break those down and prioritize and then run some tests to see how the org responds to us doing this stuff. And it feels very deja vu-ish to walk into orgs now and say, hey, you know what? I think that's how we should approach some of this work when we're taking in AI. And I really loved, I highlighted this in the book and posted it the other day on LinkedIn on how you're start with the work. Yeah, the tools are out there. There's so many tools, but start with how you work. And I find that such a refreshing perspective on all this craziness right now. It's don't lose sight of how you work. That is your day-to-day. And then start thinking through, okay, well, how do I start applying this? I don't know if you could expand on that a bit. I want to be honoring your time, but that's something that really stuck out with me.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing it, because that's why most of these transformations are failing, right? They see it as a tools transformation. So whatever your favorite stat is this week, 90% of these AI transformations are failing or not showing any return on investment. Yes, probably higher than that, by the way. And the answer is because they're all starting with a tools transformation. But it's not. It's a behavior transformation to a certain extent. It's redesigning work, as we're describing, right? And the problem with a tool is someone's opinion about how a process or a task should be done. Now, you mightn't be aware of that, but somebody inside Anthropic or OpenAI has a viewpoint that they've coded into a machine about what a good meeting report looks like. Whether you agree with it or not, they have coded that in. So again, when you start with a tool and try to apply it to an arbitrary task, one, you've no idea if the tool is made for that task. Two, you're locked into the opinion of the builder of that tool. And then the last thing anyone considers is their personal behavior or traits about how they actually do their best work. So you're sort of going at it backwards. It's a bit like, I remember you always, when Eric launched a lean startup and said, build, measure, learn. And you were like, no, guys. It's measure, build, learn, or and everyone's like, what the heck? This is sort of the thing. It's the same. It's the Derek Zoolander thing. It's the same thing. People are making the mistake again. They're starting with tools, then looking at tasks, and then thinking about themselves. The answer is you've got to be aware of how you do your best work. Like for me, talking is a huge part of what I do. It's how I do innovation. It's Socratic ideation. It's working out through ideas. Talking is a huge trait for how I innovate, actually. And tasks like meetings or innovation work or whatever. So the tools sort of pick themselves when I go, look, I talk a lot to do ideation. The task is innovation. So too, I should probably have a transcription service somewhere. It just makes sense, And so when you work, you're swimming with the sort of flow of the water or flow of your natural work versus trying to go the opposite way, And I think that's one of the biggest ahas. Again, people have these breakthroughs when they start thinking about, how do I do my best work? What tasks do I create inordinate amounts of value with? And then the tools then sort of become obvious to them, right? Because it's supporting this flow and it compounds over time. And for me, I think, again, it sort of reminds me of the measure, build, learn thing, right? Where I was like, it's just always made me smile when people were like, build, measure, learn. And you were like, no, it's actually this way.
Okay. To Eric's credit, he did say start with learn. I just don't think anyone really listened. And it was called build, measure, learn. So people just started with build because he wants to learn. Let's just start building.
Yeah, totally.
But to his credit, I did find the source one day. And he mentioned it several times. I just don't think people latched onto that part. They latched onto the build part. And I think it's not all bad, right? You can build to learn, but I think it's so easy to get caught in your trap, your build trap, as Melissa would say. With this work, where do you see this going? What are some big assumptions you have right now? And it doesn't even have to be specific to your current employer or anything like that. Just overall, where this is headed. You have your new book out, which I love, by the way. Everyone should get that book. And I want to hear from you, what is a big assumption or two that you're I think I need to go test that, but I'm not sure where to start. Or maybe I need to start prioritizing where to test that.
So I do think the point we just mentioned about people starting with tools is sort of one of the misnomers, right? So I think starting with yourself, huge. I think the other thing I've sort of observed maybe is that there's a huge anxiety in leaders that they feel like they should know this stuff, or a feeling of everybody knows this, I'm the only one who doesn't. It actually is another anxiety. Now, being an executive is pretty lonely, right? There's very few people you can turn to and go, hey, I have no idea what I'm doing here. That's why they have coaches and support groups and their peers. Because again, nobody knows the answer. Nobody knows how this is going to end. What tool's the best? Where do you, nobody knows this stuff, right? So what's worse as an exec is one, it's lonely. Two, feeling lonely and incompetent in front of a whole company is actually that's horrible, right? It's a horrible place to be. And then the reason a lot of people, especially leaders, struggle is they've no time. They have no time to just sort of sit down for an hour and play around with this stuff and use it and learn it. And because they're in back-to-back meetings all day. So they're fighting fires. And then they get to whatever time they have off in the evening, spend with their family, the weekends, they're doing it. So they don't have time. So that's probably the biggest thing I've learned is what's most powerful is just finding time. Like putting an hour aside a week or just picking one decision that you've got to make this week or one routine to say, right, I'm going to try a new way of working to try and make this decision. I'm going to dust off Microsoft Copilot and make it happen. And again, it's not like you have to change everything that you're doing. You just have to start with one decision you got to make or one process. Just like the example we shared at the start of the show with Andrew Phillips, the CTO of Skyscanner, right? He didn't know how any of this was going to work out. But that act of sort of vulnerability is actually one of the most powerful things you can do as a leader, because everyone else in the company doesn't know how this is going to end. And maybe some people are sitting at home on the weekend and building agents and all this type of stuff and posting that they've made 1,000 agents on the weekend and are making $10,000 a month from affiliate marketing fees, whatever, like just rubbish. You know, it's rubbish. You're laughing, right? So just start where you are. It's okay to be vulnerable and say, we're learning this, and then to show what you're learning. That will reduce both the leadership anxiety, but it creates, to your point again, to start the show, this safety, right? Because you're role modeling. I don't know the answer, but I'm going to try and find out. I'm going to try. Let's do it together. That's leadership for me.
I think it's a perfect point to wrap up our conversation on. We could have easily gone another couple hours, but I know you need to go. If people have listened to this and they want to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to find you?
Yeah, thanks very much. And again, David, I'm just always grateful. You ask such great questions, obviously, because you know the topic so well, but it just makes for fun conversation. So thank you for doing that today. But yeah, BarryO'Reilly.com, NobodyStudios.com, or if you're interested in reading the latest book, Artificial Organizations.com. We bought a lot of .coms the last little while. And then I'm on LinkedIn more so on other platforms. So you can follow me there. And thank you again for having me for a fun, very enjoyable conversation.
Oh, always a good time to chat. We'll put all those links in the description. Thanks again, Barry, for hanging out and just being so open and honest and sharing what's working and what's not. I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot from you. So thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for listening to another episode of How I Tested That, where we share stories about experimentation, tips, and tricks. If you learned something new, please recommend us to a friend or colleague. And remember, keep testing your ideas.